to In Search of Civility, featuring former House Minority Leader Matt Erpelding, former Ada County Commissioner Diana Lacciondo, former Idaho legislator Luke Malek, and myself, Kelly Packer. The Boise Metro Chamber and the Association of Idaho Cities have partnered to bring you this show where we will discuss the current atmosphere in Idaho, how to have hard conversations in a civil manner, how to engage with others whose views differ from our own without the conversation escalating, and many other important topics to help us return our dialogue with each other back to respectful civil interactions. From time to time, we will even touch on important policy topics and have guest appearances by other experts in this field where we currently see the most divisiveness. It's time for us to get back to being kind and civil. We'd like to thank our sponsors, Smith & Malek, Southwest Airlines, and Dawson Taylor Coffee Roasters. Smith & Malek is one of Idaho's fastest growing business law firms, founded by Peter J. Smith and Luke Malek in 2015. Their mission is to make tomorrow better. Dawson Taylor Coffee Roasters was founded in 1995 with a mission to create exceptional quality coffees in an artisanal manner. Thank you all for your support. We're now going to take just a couple of minutes and have our panelists introduce themselves briefly. We'll start with Matt Erpelding, then move to Diana Lacciondo, followed by Luke Malek, and that'll take just a few seconds before we jump into our other questions. Matt?
Thanks, Kelly. My name is Matt Erpelding. I'm currently the Vice President of Government Affairs at the Boise Metro Chamber of Commerce. And civility is interesting to me. I came into politics probably full of, for lack of a better term, piss and vinegar. I was somebody who was engaged on several policy issues over public land and education. And as soon as I got inside of the Capitol and realized that in addition to representing District 19 and my constituents, I had an obligation to create real relationships with members across the body, whether they were in the House or they were in the Senate. And I knew that the only way to accomplish anything was going to be to have those relationships. That doesn't mean that the entire time I was in there, I was civil, but it means that I knew that civility was key to accomplishing what I wanted as a member of the minority. I'm pretty concerned about where our country is headed with regard to civility, and I'm really excited that the Idaho Association of Cities, Smith & Malek, and others have come up with this idea to begin to have a larger, broader conversation about the importance of civility moving forward. And thanks again for having me.
Hi, everyone. I'm Diana Lacciondo. Until about a week and a half ago, I was one of your Ada County commissioners. Right now, I am busy trying out new baking recipes and shepherding my kids to and from school. I decided to get into public service ultimately because I realized I needed to be a part of it, because I was frustrated and I saw that there were issues that I cared about around growth, around mental health, around substance abuse, that I felt really needed a more regional perspective, and decided that I couldn't complain anymore, and I need to be a part of the process. When I think about civility, and this is something that I'm going to touch on later today, I think it really has to start from a shared understanding, a common understanding of what our issues are before we can move on to what the solutions might need to be.
Hi, I'm Luke Malek, and I am a founding member at Smith Malek, and happy to be here today. I'm also a former member of the legislature. I came into the legislature at the same time Matt did, and so we started that together and served until 2018 when I ran for Congress, lost that race, and now I am a full-time attorney and running for lieutenant governor of the state of Idaho. And I got into public service because I really, truly wanted to make a difference in the world. You heard our firm's motto, which is to make tomorrow better, and public service can be a way to make the world a better place. And as Matt said, Kelly, or as Matt said, being able to be civil is key to making sure that you can have an impact. So I'm really excited for today's discussion to talk about how civility can help us make tomorrow a better place.
Thank you. I'm excited to be part of this show with all of you. I am a former legislator and currently executive director at the Association of Idaho Cities. It's been an honor and privilege of mine to serve with 3 of the 4 panelists that are on this show, and I look forward to getting to know Diana better. I haven't had the chance to work with her one-on-one, but I'm really excited for us to be involved in helping to change the culture here in Idaho, and especially in our political conversations. It's time that when we discuss policy, we find a way to do that in a more respectful manner. And with that, I'd like to jump into our first question. We'll start with you, Luke, if that's all right. How do you define civility?
It's a real basic question, but obviously a very important question to what we're talking about, right? Usually when you think about civility, you think about just being polite, and that is key to it, of being polite in a situation where you're dealing with other people. And being courteous, and it brings up a whole slew of words that you could categorize under civility. Just treating people with respect and engaging on a level that encourages engagement rather than discourages engagement. And when you talk about public service, it really becomes a really critical topic and concept to think about, because when you're talking about public service, you're talking about issues that naturally have a lot of conflict in them. As you're seeing in our dialogue throughout the world right now, really in our country, even here in the state of Idaho, there's a lot of conflict. And the more we can approach that in a way that is civil, the more of an impact we're going to be able to have. You know, I'm sure you've heard that grace is when God doesn't give you what you do deserve, or grace is when God gives you what you don't deserve. Mercy is when God doesn't give you what you do deserve. I would say that civility is when you don't behave in a way that you might feel possibly entitled to behave, because we care about the issues that we're fighting for. We care about the way that we represent the people that we do in whatever capacity that may be. And when somebody slights us, our natural inclination is to fight back as hard as we can, and sometimes that means throwing decorum out the window. And so having a conversation and really focusing on, it's most important to be civil when you're least expected to be, because that's when the conversation really happens. A good conversation really happens around.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's so important that we learn how to engage and normalize some of these conversations. I really appreciate how that definition, and also how that can be utilized in improving relationships with others. Let's move to you, Matt. As an elected official, how did you pursue civility with your colleagues and constituents, particularly those who disagreed with you?
You know, at times it was very difficult, because like Luke said, these issues that we're dealing with in the political realm are somewhat contentious, to say the least about it. We're talking about civil rights, we're talking about social issues, we're talking about adequately funding things that are important to our constituents and to our communities. And then at the same time, you're talking about groups of people who many times absolutely think that their way is right. And that was where I think the challenge was in the legislature. We are kind of set up to have differences right out of the gate. So Democrat and Republican, and the 3 of us, we were all elected together in 2012. And there's no doubt that when we were in office together that we had major disagreements. I remember calling Luke on the floor one time and really trying to convince him that he needed to vote a certain way. But I needed to remember, and this was a piece to how I was able to manage civility in the legislature. I needed to remember that District 4, the district that Luke represented, or District 28, you know, the outskirts of Pocatello, the district that you represented, are very different neighborhoods and very different groups of people that want different things out of our legislative body. And when I was able to actually take a step back and put myself into the shoes of the other legislators, recognizing that I may never agree with a representative from Reagan's Idaho, but that representative is doing their best to represent their constituency as they see fit. That allowed me to take a step back from what is an absolutely maddening challenge inside of the legislature to get an issue across. But then it also allowed me to say, wait a second, they're doing their job. I'm going to try to build a legitimate relationship with Representative Packer or Representative Malek or whoever it was. And in my case, the way that I manage civility is often probably perceived as a bit of a defense mechanism, but I used humor as a way to connect with my colleagues. I reminded colleagues where I stood on behalf of District 19, but I did try to make time to get to know folks. So, I mean, a great memory I have is sitting on Luke's front porch with him when we were both in the legislature and being up in Coeur d'Alene, knowing that I was about to go do a Democratic event and blast Luke on, I don't remember what it was, minimum wage or whatever. But the night before, we had an incredible barbecue. We had a great time. And I basically said, I have to do this because we disagree on this issue. And we were able to respect one another for that. What's happened in our society now and what's really challenging is that it's like we can't be friends with folks who we disagree with. And some of that's fed by social media and this desire to write whatever we want and think and feel on our social channels. But from a civility perspective, you know, we're all human. We all are fallible. We all have an opportunity to learn from our colleagues. And I think when you really try to do that, you can connect and you can move legislation in a bipartisan manner, and you can have civil discussions that don't result in people's feelings getting hurt. It is hard in certain circumstances where you're talking about the lives of human beings or the well-being of human beings, and that's probably one of the hardest things. And you know, I think about John Lewis, who just passed away, and his deal was to never resent those people that were against the work that he was doing. And I tried to do that when I was in the legislature. And there were times at the end of the session where I did have that feeling of resent toward what had happened during the session. And I had to really take time to cool down before I could go back to many of my friends who I viscerally disagreed with. But if John Lewis was able to do it and he was carrying something as important as civil rights, I always thought that I could do it in the Idaho legislature.
Thanks, Matt. I know that I really enjoyed working with you in the legislature. We didn't necessarily always see eye to eye, but one thing I really respected is that we were always able to have a conversation, and you didn't make it personal. It didn't get ugly and down in the mud, I guess, so to speak. And so I really appreciated that. And while it's not necessarily always easy, especially when we feel so passionate about our positions, it's always an important part of getting to a good solution for all when we can actually work together and work across party lines especially, but even philosophical differences. Diana, you're the most recent person to have held office, and you experienced some of the most uncivil behavior Idaho has seen in a long time. How did you try to change the conversation to maintain civility in such a difficult environment? And particularly when people sometimes seem to operate with two sets of facts.
Well, Kelly, I think you've hit on the key point there, which is what I brought up earlier. We have to start from some kind of shared understanding of what the facts are, and then we can debate what the solutions are to that set of facts. I tend to think in examples, so I'll give you a couple. I really ran on a platform of addressing growth here in the Treasure Valley. And immediately upon taking office, we set about trying to understand what was going on with growth, really diving into the data. And then from there, hosting a series of convenings around the community to share what our findings were. And what we learned as commissioners was that growth is happening, and I'm certainly not anti-growth, but I want to be thoughtful about how we grow. And we shared the facts. We showed our constituents that the way we were growing was fiscally irresponsible for us as taxpayers. And so if you can get to that basis of understanding, then we can get into solutions. What are we going to do about that? But we have to start with some kind of shared understanding. The other most recent example that I'm sure everybody's very familiar with are restrictions that as a Board of Health member, I was asked to vote on. And as I'm reflecting on my time on the Board of Health, I'm actually thinking that maybe we didn't start from a great place of shared understanding. And were I to do it over again, I think I would have advocated really kind of getting the board and the community to a place first of understanding of what crisis standards of care are at our hospitals. And if we understand what that is, if we have some kind of agreement even that that's unacceptable, then we can go from there. But maybe there are some people for whom getting to crisis standards of care wasn't a move too far. And so for me, it always was. And so I think maybe that's something that we could have done a little bit differently in order to maintain those civil discussions and be able to move the ball forward.
You know, you actually handled all of that with such grace. I was so in awe of how well you handled such tumultuous times for you and your family. I still cannot fathom how anyone felt it was all right to cross that boundary, so to speak, and to come to your home. And it had to have been really hard for you and your family, but well done. You handled it well, and I admire that in you. Luke, we're going to come back to you again. What role does civility play when there doesn't seem to be any middle ground anymore?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and I don't think we really laid out. You know, as Matt was talking, I was thinking about the fact that I had kind of opened up an invitation to him to come and have a beer anytime he was campaigning against me up in North Idaho. But for those listeners who don't know, this panel consists of 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. So Kelly and I, and Kelly came into the legislature at the same time that Matt and I did. Kelly and I are Republicans, and Matt and Diana are Democrats, and so that was why we set this up the way that we could, so that we could give a demonstration of how people can act civilly, even though they don't necessarily agree on issues. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And right now, to your question, Kelly, there are so many issues that are causing such a deep divide that can't seem to be crossed. How do you justify some of these debates that are happening and find middle ground when there doesn't seem to be a possible way to find that middle ground? And you could just list the issues off. Can someone who is pro-police understand Black Lives Matters, and can someone that is a proponent of Black Lives Matters understand the perspective of police officers or those who are pro-police? And I think that the answer is absolutely yes, they can, but that doesn't seem to be part of the public dialogue. And you can just, again, list down the number of issues and deal with the facts as they are, right? And when there's debate over what the actual facts are, it makes it even more difficult. And so I think that's really the role that civility plays. If you can sit and listen to each other without becoming empathic, without reacting in a way that you may feel justified in acting because you care so much about the issue that you're dealing with, that's how you can have a conversation and get to the real meat of where you agree and where you disagree, right? And the more we talk, the more we're able to hear each other, the more we can get to common ground.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I was blessed to be raised by parents who taught me early on that everyone can have their own opinion, they just can't have their own facts, and I think sometimes that gets lost in all of this. So really important point. Matt, when we developed this series, we had no idea that some of the armed demonstrations we've actually seen in Idaho would escalate to an insurrection in our nation's capital. Do you have hope after the events of January 6th?
Oh, that's a hard question. Here's one thing I will consider, and as I've been watching some of the comments that are coming in on this, and your comment really hit a moment of truth for me, and that is part of civil discussion is that we do need to be operating off of the same set of facts. And some of the challenges that we're seeing is we pick our news channel and then we disappear into that world, and that's the only side that we listen to, whether it be MSNBC, Fox News, whatever the new ones are, Newsmax, all these other things. And with this big occurrence that occurred at the Capitol, this insurrection, you had a group of people that were operating off of a different set of facts from a majority of the United States, and that was who won the election. The hard part of that is, how do we get back to a place where people still respect the freedom of the press, the importance of the press, but don't get their news from siloed places that might be spreading misinformation and falsehoods? And that challenge is such a heavy lift. I do have hope. I was impressed with Senator Romney's comments on the floor. I was impressed with many of the other members who came out after the insurrection to talk about how we need to protect American democracy. And with American democracy comes this idea of civility, this idea that we can, even for that matter, be in the same household and have differing political views, but talk about them and believe in them. But I am very concerned, and I continue to be concerned with essentially what grew out of the 1980s, which was the removal of the fairness doctrine, which was a media doctrine that kind of helped control the difference between what is an actual news report and what is commentary that is disguised as news. And I don't personally have a solution for how to address those really complex issues within the media, and that idea that people are gathering information from disparately different sources, both of which appear to be sources that might present fact. That's deeply concerning for me. But I think that we have an opportunity to turn the page. Whether you voted for Joe Biden or not, we have an opportunity to say he's our president. We're going to support him. Certainly, we're going to disagree on policy moving forward, but I think there is an opportunity to say we've got a lot of problems in the United States, but this is one thing that we don't want to create for ourselves. And I have hope, but I do think that this program is really important. And I do think that as we move forward over the coming months, we need to have the hard conversations about social equity, about racial struggles in the United States, about things that are complex, and try to at least, we may not agree on policy solutions, and that's great, but at least come to the same set of facts that are out there, and to not exist in a binary world. You know, the Republicans don't have a corner on the correct ideas. The Democrats don't have a corner on the right ideas. And to Luke's point, the police have a role in our society, but there is also the consideration that the Black Lives Matter groups are pointing out that there's inequities. And what are we going to do to say, okay, there's truth in both arenas. Now, how do we get policy that we can all agree on? And I do have hope that we can do that. And I think that this recent incident at the Capitol will press us toward that. And I hope it presses DC toward that, because they're the most partisanized and binary amongst us in the US.
Absolutely, I agree. And I actually have hope too. You know, it was really disheartening to watch what happened, but we have an opportunity as individuals to seek to understand others, right? It does not need to dilute our value system where we're at in the world, when we simply seek to understand all of the facts, also the positions where people are coming from, and then to ascertain from there, hopefully, some negotiated ways forward and best policies moving forward. Excellent information. Diana, what's your hope for Idaho's current delegation during this extremely divisive time?
Well, I know they're just waiting on pins and needles to hear what I have to say, but I would pick up on something that Matt stated. Something Mitt Romney said really struck me, and it was, we do not respect our constituents by not being honest with them. And I think we are all due for some hard truths about what's happening, whether it's the outcome of an election, or whether it's the budget process, what have you. Our elected leaders need to be honest with us about the challenges that they're facing, again, so that we can grapple with the hard issues ahead and give some credit to the electorate. It's often too easy and too cheap to lay some sound bites out there to play off things. Nuance is harder, and oftentimes nuance is not sexy. Being a moderate is not necessarily sexy. So it's really my hope that we see honesty about what these challenges are coming out of our congressional delegation. I want to read a quote for you that really struck me from a newly elected Republican representative from Michigan. When asked he voted to impeach. And when asked if he was concerned that that ended his career, he said, I may very well have, but it's important that we have elected leaders who are not thinking solely about what's in their self-interest, not what is politically expedient, but what we actually need for the country. And, you know, as I reflect on my own short time in office, I had to make choices that I knew were not in service of getting reelected. And I had to do that this year. And at the end of the day, for me, while hard, I knew that I could walk away with my head held high, and I will never have to explain to my children the votes that I took. And I think that's what we need to look for in our elected leaders.
Absolutely. Well said. All right, Luke and Matt, I'm going to see if you two can play nice. I'm going to ask you both the same question, and we'll see how this plays out. We want to see some civil discourse here, young man. Okay. What role does listening to understand play here? And what about having relationships with people and truly getting to know them as human beings and not labels, especially not party labels?
Go ahead, Luke.
Yeah, you know, I believe that the isolation that we faced in 2020 going into 2021 has played a tremendous role in how civil discourse and how public discourse has taken shape over the past year. Because, as someone said in the comments, humanizing each other is an extremely important part of the dialogue. And the more we dehumanize each other, the more we're separated by space and time and you know, interacting with each other as digital faces rather than actually having to look into the eyes of a fellow human being, the easier it is to throw discourse, civil discourse to the side and just advocate with whatever means you have, with whatever energy you have, whether that's productive or not, and you start to lose perspective. And I think that's had a huge role. And the further you get down that road of being uncivil in these passionate issues, the harder it is to listen. And listening and hearing each other is absolutely critical to understanding where common ground is. And if you don't care where the common ground is, and you're willing to burn anything down just to get your point across, then you're never going to make a difference in the world, right? And I think that's something that's really been lost in this past year, and it often does in politics anyway, in political discourse, right? But because you believe so fervently no other view can be right, well, that ignores the fact that you're never going to eliminate the people that disagree with you, right? And until you recognize that they're always going to be part of the dialogue and that their perspective has to be heard, you're going to be at the losing end of the argument, because you're going to be failing to recognize that there's another human being with true feelings and perspectives on the other side of that conversation.
Yeah, and this idea of humanizing each other, when we kind of move forward with this, you know, Kelly, I want to thank you for bringing this to us and having this idea, because its relevance is so critical. But one of the things that the four of us really struggled with was, what do we talk about in our first installment of this? Because, you know, we could talk about, some of the questions in here are about press, about partisanship, about all of these things that are adding to incivility. But one thing in a lot of reading that I've done that's rung true with me is, I think one of the reasons that, one, I enjoyed my time in the legislature, and two, I was able as a member of the minority to accomplish some policy objectives, was I did take the time, and I intentionally took the time to get to know legislators who I knew I would disagree with. So an example would be Terry Gestrin, who is he's a representative from Valley County. He owns a feed store in Donnelly, and he came to expect me to stop at his store at least a couple times a year. And it wasn't so I could, you know, talk to him about a policy idea or anything like that. It was simply just to check in with him, get a tour of his store, and get to know him a little bit. And the truth is, we've lost that. We've lost that in that we don't take the time to get to know one another, and then we just start throwing bombs at each other. And I don't understand how anybody can expect to get anything done if you can't walk into somebody's office and ask them how their wife is, ask them how their husband is, before you get into the really meaty, heavy stuff that makes people upset and drives people into their corners. So I think that the way that we get to a place is, we got to get back to spending time together. And I know that sounds like high level stuff and superficial, but for those people that haven't been in political office, it's really pretty simple. Taking the time to ask someone to go have a beer with you at the end of a long day, if they drink beer. If they don't drink beer, they can have ice cream while you drink beer, like whatever. But having conversation about their life outside of the legislature and creating those human connections is step one. In the case of DC, you know, beginning in the 90s, they stopped staying in DC and representatives and senators really started coming home, and you started to see a decline. So there's a host of things that we could push and blame for the incivility that's in our environment right now. We could say that it's the two camps in the media world. We could say it's the fairness doctrine. We could say that, you know, states are different, but in the end, it's that we are not taking the time to develop quality relationships across party lines and then using the C word, compromise. I know that I'm not going to get everything I want as a leader, and I don't expect to. And it's unfortunate that that's how most people look at the body politic, which is winner take all. That isn't how it was ever set up to be, and that's not how it should be. So I'm really an advocate. I told my minority caucus on a regular basis, go out into the rest of Idaho and like meet with Republican legislators on their own turf. Buy them lunch, get to know them, build relationships that are quality so you can actually have a conversation with them back in session. Sorry about that. I was supposed to unmute you.
She's still muted there, Matt.
Yep.
You're good.
Matt didn't want me to ever talk to you guys. Be uncivil. No, I'm just kidding. No, I couldn't agree more. Matt and Luke, thank you very much for the words of wisdom. I want to share just really quickly a story that happened to me when I was a freshman legislator that really brought that home, Matt, what you were talking about. There was a member of the Democrat Party who was going through some problems with health problems with his wife. And he was gone for a short period of time. And when he came back, I made it a point to stop by his desk and ask him how he was. And I made it to my desk on the floor and sat down, and my phone immediately was ringing. And it was an individual from my party that said, you know, why were you talking to him? And I said, well, because I wanted to check and see how his wife was. And he says, you know, he's a Democrat, right? And I mean, I was floored. I looked back thinking, okay, I'm getting punked. That was a joke, right? And they were dead serious when I looked and met eye to eye with them, still on the phone though. And I said, they're a person first. And that's what we need to remember and what we need to get back to. We are all individuals. We are all people with, you know, our own insecurities, our own desires, our own need to make a difference in this world and to be accepted. And we can't lose sight of that. We can't lose sight of the fact that individuals have been elected to represent their constituency and their body and do the very best job they can based on the philosophies and visions that they shared with their constituents that they would take to the state house or wherever they might be, including city government. And we need to start recognizing them as people first. And like you said, talk through the policy.
So Kelly, I have a question for you. I'm sort of interested, you know, someone who's worked in local government, that's really where my heart lies. And now that you're in the city's role, what role do you see civility in local government playing? And is it getting more difficult with this rise in partisanship? I've always seen local government as a place where the rubber meets the road, quite literally. Things need to get done. What are you seeing at the local level, and how can Association of Idaho Cities assist?
Thank you for that question. You know, it's important at all levels that we learn to work together and that elected officials model proper behavior. The Association of Idaho Cities has a handful of training around this particular topic that we will be sharing at our upcoming events, both at our annual conference as well as some of the in-person regional meetings that we'll be doing. The National League of Cities also has a lot of great webinars and other tools that can be used in how elected officials can normalize some of the hard discussions that we have to have. And so there's a lot of tools and resources that we are providing for our elected officials. But more importantly than that, I think that you find, even though as emphasis on our political parties or our party loyalty has been enhanced, we've seen, in my opinion, a greater divisiveness amongst elected officials. I don't think that it's as prominent at the local level because those are typically nonpartisan seats. And the issues that they're dealing with are very nonpartisan. Potholes, for example, are nonpartisan. Clean drinking water and flushing toilets and water pressure and all of those things are really nonpartisan issues. And many of our elected officials, especially in Idaho, because we have such small cities predominantly, our elected officials are part-time elected officials in most of those roles, and they're just doing everything they can to stay on top of the needs and to make the decisions on a day-to-day basis that are important to their citizens and keeping things running in their community. So while it is bleeding down to the local level somewhat, I don't think that it's as extensive because they recognize that the issues are less partisan in nature, and because they don't have the time to maybe pontificate on political philosophies as much. So we will continue to provide training and to reach out with our national partners on training and tools for our elected officials. And hopefully we can encourage all of us as individuals to model better behavior in all of our discussions. We'd like to again thank our sponsors, Smith and Malek, Southwest Airlines, and Dawson Taylor Coffee Roasters for their support of today's show. Please remember to follow the Boise Metro Chamber and the Association of Idaho Cities or any of today's panelists on social media for information on upcoming shows. And please spread the word about this series to your friends and family. We'll see you next time on February 16th in Search of Civility, unless there is something more from any of you as panelists for the good of the order.
I just want to mention that the comments that are coming in, we're getting those, and in particular, some of them about the press and about the use of power, and some of the other things are actually going to be entire topics that we're going to speak to over the coming months. And so, if you didn't get your question answered today, give us some time to try to build this out, and we will be having guests, particularly when we talk about contentious issues like race. Those are things that the four of us can't address in a vacuum, and so we will have other people on as well.
So in service of trying to get to know my fellow panelists better, I have a closing question. Who are you rooting for to win the Super Bowl this year, Representative Malek? Oh, he's on mute. All right, Kelly, you're up.
I want to hear what his answer was. Luke?
Yeah, well, and Matt told me, like, don't leave
I
it to
can't
me.
tell you who won out of the Chiefs and Browns.
This is devolving quickly. No, I just hope both teams have fun.
Oh,
I'm
come
rooting
on.
for the Broncos.
Yeah.
All right, we'll see.
Thank you all. Thank you all for today, and we'll be back on February 16th.